Welcome to the Open Scene monthly lecture. Today we are lucky and proud to have Rayan Alnayal with us. She's going to explore on the idea of magic realistic, and the subject will be about the multicultural identities through digital art design. Rayan is architect. I've got to study at Greenwich, and she have got many projects, and we are happy to explore with her this minefield of multiple identities. Welcome, Rayan.
Thank you. So this presentation is titled Building Afrabia, and I named it that because the project, though it consists of finished images, in my mind it's still experimental and has still space to grow. So Building Afrabia is based on this project that I called a Magic Realist Afrabia, which is about projecting the Sudanese scene in London, and in particular Church Street in Paddington, which we're all familiar with and is near Edgware Road. And I was looking at the idea of how you could produce a multicultural space, hybrid place, that is representative of another place. So projecting Sudan into Paddington, London, and what that would look like. And so one of the things I struggled with at the beginning was what types of forms of expression that I would use. And so I started kind of mapping out my different ideas. And so the core of the project was having this hybrid urban place that is both Afro-Arab and British. And so it's like kind of a hybrid of Sudan and Britain, which is why I have the two maps here. And then I kind of looked at hybridity, and in particular decolonization and post-colonialism, the Afro, the Arab, the Western and the Afro-Arab, the first, the second place, and the third place. So when I say the third place, I'm referring to a theoretical space, which is representing the in-between space that Edward Said often spoke about. So the first place for me is Britain. It's where I was born. I've never lived anywhere else. The second place is Sudan. But then this occupancy of the third place means that I feel like I'm neither Sudanese or British, because of that hybridity. And it's a common thing, and a lot of people of different cultures feel like they occupy a third space that's neither here or there, that we know Edward Said spoke about quite a lot, being Palestinian American. And I thought the space was both magical and real. The third space is so real to me, but it's not something physical and something I could grasp and present to people. And so that's when I started looking at magic realism. And magic realism, historically, in literature, has been used by people who were affected by post-colonialism. So it stemmed from Latin American culture, but again, people who were Western and non-Western at the same time and wanted to explain what it's like to live in that third space. Magic realism is great because it's an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense to be both magical and real at the same time. But for me, that is parallel to what the third space is like. The idea of being from neither here or there, I found that magic realism was actually the right form of expression to use. So here I have questions on why magic realism. Magic realism in photography, in art, in literature, often focused on the idea of polyvocality, which is being able to tell multiple different stories at the same time, which I found already exist in Tayeb Salih's موسم الهجرة للشمال, Season of Migration to the North. It's a novel about this character called Mustafa Saeed, who travels from Sudan to London with the notion that he's going to decolonize Sudan by tricking European women. But what I found interesting about the novel was that he used aesthetics. He used things like sandalwood, photographs of pyramids, of sand and desert, and the desert, to lure this European woman into playing into this exotic African Arab man that he was, which is obviously offensive. But he used that as a kind of a tool in his mind, obviously, to decolonize Sudan. So that polyvocality was very important for me, and it existed in Magic Realism, and so I took it furthermore. I was also interested in ethnic enclaves, so like Chinatowns, for example, in London, that are hybrid urban places that are quite real, but they are made up of usually two different aesthetics. So here I have the Chinatown gate, and then I have market stalls. So when reading about Chinatown architectures, I found that there was usually a portion of the Chinatown that was designed to suit for the Western or the Orientalist eye, which is why it was, you see the Chinatown gate, it's very vulgar, it's not representative of modern day China, but it's very traditional, and it's what the Orientalist or the Western view of China is. But then it's also made up of spaces that the natives can go to and actually buy everyday products, and they are quite authentic. And so going back to Church Street, Paddington at the bottom, I picked Church Street because it's just off of Edgware Road, and we all know that Edgware Road is like the Little Arabia of London. So it's already a hybrid urban place, but also because on Church Street you do have a small Afro-Arab community, and actually at the end of Church Street there's a building called Al Faiz, which is an antique store made up of many different sellers of different ethnicities. But what I found interesting about Al Faiz is that it was called both Alfiz and Al Faiz, so it had an Arabic name and an English name, and it in itself was a hybrid urban place. And so on one side of the building you have ancient Egyptian paintings, and then on the other side you have Gustav Klimt's European paintings. And so for me that was kind of like a step forward in to deciding this is the correct site for the project. And so also on the side here I was looking at Orientalism in painting, in art. So so here I have the Orientalist, which is European, that painted his view of what Afro-Arab men were. So this is Salih and Tayeb Salih in London in 1971, I believe. This is me trying to find an artist that was modern, but also potentially he's Sudanese and British at the same time. Tayeb Salih was also British Sudanese at the same time, and they both had this very modern hybrid form of expression that they developed. And so one thing I tried to highlight within this project, because this project was originally presented to a board of people who were English, who weren't non-Western. And so trying to deliver the idea of what Sudan is was very difficult. So I had to kind of go back in my mind and see what I think Sudan is, or what we all know is Sudan. And so one thing I realized that was kind of like embedded in us, but not quite explained or not quite represented in Sudan's image, is the diversity of Sudan. So other than adding this level of complexity to the identity, which is to make it British, Sudanese itself is very complicated. I find that we're still deciding whether we're Afro or Arab, but at the same time, it's visually very diverse. You know, it's made up of so many tribes, so many languages, and one quote that I think sums up that kind of that essence is by Jamal Mahjoub, who says that Sudan is not really a country at all, but many, a composite layers like a genetic fingerprint of memories that were once fluid, but have since crystallized out from the crucible of possibility, which I think is a beautiful quote that sums up the essence of Sudan's diversity, which is, he's saying it's not really a country at all. It's kind of many countries all at the same time. So again, here, this is me saying, actually, going back to Magic Realism's use of polyvocality. If Sudan is this multiple different countries at the same time, surely polyvocality would be the right forms of expression. And Magic Realism allows for that. And so this is kind of, when I was putting some research together, looking at just sheer parallels between Sudan and Britain. And so this is like me mapping out Mustafa and his throne. So you've got the River Nile there, but you've also got the River Thames. And obviously Mustafa Said was seeking vengeance for Western colonization. That was his motivation for going to London. But also his reasoning for going there was that he was told that this country hasn't got the scope for that brain of yours. To take yourself off, go to Egypt or Lebanon or England, we have nothing further to give you. And that was his, him being told that he needs to leave and go to London and pursue this degree because of his intellectual mind. And so, again, here, there's this Afro-Arab identity that is so complex and so difficult to define, but it's a little bit of a diasporic dream for us, especially people who are Sudanese but live elsewhere or live in the West. And so combining that with Magic Realism to create this heterotopia. So the heterotopia for me, it's that Afrabia, the hybrid urban place. Also, if you have any questions, please don't mind. I don't mind people asking me questions or interrupting me. So I started to kind of extract places from the novel that use the power of aesthetics or the power of decoration, the power of architecture and interior to kind of communicate an idea about post-colonialism. And one of them is obviously Mustafa's bedroom of lethal liars, which he says, my house, the den of lethal lies that I had deliberately built up, lie upon lie, the sandalwood and incense, the ostrich feathers, the ivory and ebony figurines, the paintings and drawings of forests of palm trees along the shores of the Nile, boats with sails like doves' wings, suns setting over the mountain of the Red Sea, camel caravans wending their way along sand dunes on the borders of the Yemen, baobab trees in Kordofan, naked girls from the tribes of the Zandi, and so on. So he uses here clearly very kind of Orientalist aesthetics in his bedroom, and kind of non-authentic aesthetics to what Sudan is. And so this is when I realized there was a potential also to take, say, the sandalwood, or like in the Sudan's independence war, the camel becomes a symbol for the kind of exoticism that's related to the desert or Sudan. So what is magic realism? Magic realism has been defined as an amalgamation of a rational and irrational worldview. And so for me, the rational was I am from two different places at the same time, and the irrational being that I feel like I'm from neither of one of those places at the same time. And also I found that theorists had historically said that there's a relationship between magic realism and the third space. And so you could use magic realism in art, in literature, in, I believe, design and architecture as well, when talking about the third space. So some of magic realism's characteristics is cultural hybridity, which is like the first and second place and third place, but also hyperreality. So being able to take different aesthetics and materials and like hybridizing them and making them look as real as possible. If I'm going to represent my idea of what that third space is, I need to make it look as hyperreal as possible to someone who may not understand what it's like to be British Afro-Arab. And one other interesting characteristic in literature is the non-linearity of it. So that's in, like, for example, Season of Migration to the North, going back and forth. There's no beginning, middle, and end. There is just going back and forwards, to tell the story. Because kind of like in a story like that, time is kind of not relative, which is kind of, if you imagine, it's suited to that third space, because if that third space doesn't really exist and it's just theoretical, the non-linearity helps in showing you how magical really that space is. It's not all bad being, from that third space. It can be confusing, but it can also be a beautiful thing. So also like polyvocality, like I said before. But one thing that I found I was drawn to magic realism for was how it exposed cultural misrepresentation. And so, for example, in Mustafa's Den of Lethal Lies, the way he communicates that room, he calls it the Den of Lethal Lies. He's using these exotic and inappropriate aesthetics, but actually he's calling it lies. He's called this space a lie, which is exposing kind of Orientalism and exoticism. These are just some more definitions. So Homi K. Baba actually was someone who spoke quite a lot about the third space, and he says it's the literary language of the emerging post-colonial globalized world. And then he also says that it allows for one to speculate on how to fill in the gaps of cultural misrepresentation. If cultural globalization is pushing for a world where ethnocentric kind of ideas are being pushed aside, and we are told, okay, no, it's not all about being Sudanese anymore, we're just people of the world. That is also pretending that there's no, like, colonialism never happened and that post-colonialism isn't a thing. It's convenient for the Western world, but for the non-Western world that still is in the process of telling their own histories, especially histories like Sudan that's been stolen from us, magic realism comes in to kind of communicate to many different people at the same time using the same type of aesthetic. So why Anglo-Sudanese? When I was trying to communicate this idea of magic realism potentially being used in design, I found that there was not much material. Not many people believe that it can be used. And so I thought maybe I could talk about Sudanese magic realism potentially, because most magic realist novels brand colonial power as Eurocentric, so that could be either American or European. So for, say, Morocco, for example, it would be the French. So it's kind of resisting that. But in Sudan, you have an interesting space because the colonialist power isn't necessarily Eurocentric. It can be Arab-centric as well. You have Arab and Euro colonization in Sudan's history. And so you have this completely different layer to what traditional magic realist novels used. And it doesn't exist in Latin American post-colonial theory. Brenda Cooper, who is a post-colonial critic, says that magic realism at its best opposes fundamentalism and purity. It is at odds with racism, ethnicity, and the quest for taproots, origins, and homogeneity. And so I love this quote because it sums up how magic realism can actually it's always trying to be an activist and resist certain social and political situations. And so this is also me just looking at modern Western philosophers who also believe that magic realism is re-emerging in our world. But when I was looking at kind of magic realism and ethnocentric design, I was trying to find how has it been used already. And so one place that potentially people say it's been used in is in Wakanda, which is from the Black Panther movie. And Wakanda is very interesting because it's gotten quite a lot of attention, and people label it as Afrofuturism. I personally have problems with Afrofuturism, which I'll explain in a little bit, but this is what Wakanda looks like. And Afrofuturist theorists have said, that Afrofuturism is made up of an element of magic realism as well. So this is another image of what Wakanda looks like. And then I came across this article. Design is like a design magazine. And the title was Afrofuturism is creating a different narrative for Africa, say creatives, which I personally found really offensive, because to assume that Afrofuturism is now the narrative for Africa, which is what 54 countries, it can be deeply problematic because it's one type of aesthetic, especially because Afrofuturism has been criticized. So one critic said that Afrofuturism has nothing to do with Africa and everything to do with cyberculture in the West. So that is just the belief that actually Afrofuturism is taking Western sci-fi and painting it with African patterns and African aesthetics that are quite vulgar, but not actually looking into the depth of what existing African modernism is. What does modernism in the East mean? And so it's not looking at the real existing definitions of modernism in Africa and in the East. And instead it's taking modernism in the West and painting it with African aesthetics and saying this is what Africa should look like. And then this is when I started to think, is Wakanda or is Afrofuturism an example of 21st century Orientalism? which I think it is. So when I was presenting my project to a board of people who had never been to Sudan, maybe didn't know anyone Sudanese before me, I realized I had this image in my head of, I go to Sudan every year, I understand what Sudan looks like, and we all understand what the Sudanese aesthetic is, or what it means maybe to be Sudanese. And so I started to I went to Sudan actually, and I took some pictures. So this is one I took of a kind of like an aerial view of a city. And I wanted to kind of show how it's a mashup of so many different aesthetics. And it's kind of liberated from the type of architecture that you have here that is always so contextual, always has to respond to neighboring buildings. Sudan has a little bit more freedom in its kind of urban fabric. But also, I realized that there were certain icons that we were familiar with and that were embedded in our minds. For example, like Masjid Al-Nilain, which is like an architectural icon for us, but maybe not for others. And I think it's a beautiful modern building, and it was important for me to represent good examples of African or Sudanese modernism that exists today. This was just the Orientalist paintings that I mentioned before, that was painted by Europeans. So this is one of the first images I created. This was Mustafa's Den of Lethal Lies. So going back to the Alfie store that was on Church Street, I imagined Mustafa's Den of Lethal Lies actually being a trading unit. So the Alfie's building is made up of several different glass buildings, very small glass units inside, where traders can sell antiques from their building. And they're liberated from the high street regulations, so they decorate their units with all types of antiques, which I think is very beautiful. So you can go in there and kind of go, okay, that guy looks like he sells West African textiles, and that guy over there looks like he sells Egyptian antiques, or because of the kind of Orientalist or ethnocentric aesthetics that they decorate their buildings with. And so this is just imagining Mustafa's Den of Lethal Lies as an Alfie's unit, where Mustafa just sells books and just stuff that belongs to him. So this is where I kind of reappropriated some of the aesthetics that he used within the Den of Lethal Lies, and kind of replaced them with maybe like a postmodern version of what I think it could be. And so you have like the camel, you have the fake palm tree, and you have the Nefertiti in the background, and you have the sandalwood burning in the middle, kind of building this very exotic version, hyper small version of what Sudan maybe could be. And just here at the front, I take some of Ibrahim Salih's forms and I transform them to kind of interior aesthetics. So that's one of them. That's just zooming into maybe Mustafa selling his books. And so I would take people from the Orientalist paintings that I mentioned before and put them into these images. And then looking back at Chinatown architectures and how they always have this very elaborate gate, I decided to build a gate for Afrabia, which takes this existing residential building on Edgware Road, which is the entrance to Church Street, and it takes Nefertiti and her hand, which has henna tips on them at the end, with the sign Afrabia in the middle. And there's Masjid Al-Nilain in the back being mirrored, and I put wings on it to show, because actually I'll show you, these are maps I created to map out the existing Afrabian journey. So you have Little Arabia here, which is Edgell Road, and then you have Church Street, and then actually at the end of the route there is Regent's Mosque as well. And so there was actually already an existing Afrabian journey within Church Street and within Edgell Road that I wanted to tap into. So taking these things, I made Church Street its kind of entrance, its market, and its final destination, which is Regent's Mosque, into my Afrabia. And so you can see here on the right, this is the existing, and this was kind of like the proposed new Church Street, which still has the market stalls, but right here you have that gate with Nefertiti. And so this is kind of like an aerial view. So this is like an axonometric of Afrabia. You've got the gate here on the left, and then you have the market stalls, and you have the Afrabian gardens, and then you have a Jemina cafe at the end as well. Yeah, and there's a Hosh as well in there. This piece was called East Meets West. And so in the background, I had the Alfi's dealers. So, for example, I have the Khatat, or the calligrapher, in the middle, selling bits of calligraphy. And then that's Mustafa's Den of Lethal Lies next to it. And then here on the left, I have the perfumer. So this is that, the three buildings in the background. But I called this piece East Meets West. So I had the kind of existing Western residential aesthetic still there, and then kind of introducing the Eastern to it. And there's still the fake palm trees, and this it's using Magic Realism as a way of kind of unpacking how that aesthetic can be beautiful or can be postmodern. They were kind of like experimental. So this is East Meets West. This here is actually Afrabia, but from another entrance. So if I go back here, right at the bottom you have where Broadley Street Gardens would actually be. And so I built another smaller entrance to Afrabia, which is here. And so this is Mustafa's private room in the right. This is the entrance. And then here you have a minaret in the background, but also a hosh. And then these are the gardens of Afrabia. So Gardens of Afrabia with the red arches, if I go back, is in the center here. So that's Gardens of Afrabia. Again, taking things like even right here you have the Tudor toilets. So if you do walk down Church Street, you'll see that I've actually taken some things that actually exist on the street right now and translated them or I just kept them in the Afrabia, because for me Afrabia is not something that's just Afro-Arab. With this project in particular, it had to be British as well. It was all about the British and Afro-Arab hybrid, and how magical that space could be. And then on the right there I have the Jebena Cafe, where coffee is made and served. And then this is kind of the conclusion for me in the end, was looking at the weaknesses of Magic Realism, kind of being self-critical about how problematic it's been. It has this indefinite nature where it can start to mean anything and everything at the same time, but also putting it parallel to the weaknesses of Afrofuturism, which is geographical provincialism. Africa is made up of 54 countries, but it's very difficult to make Afrofuturism kind of represent all of them or any of them at the same time. And for me, the reason why I was looking at Afrofuturism was because I found that Western sci-fi was actually very productive in providing ideas on new technologies in the West, kind of progressive theories. So I came across even an example where in a Star Trek film, there was a motion censored, a very old, one of the first Star Trek episodes, a motion censored TV, and that actually it resulted in that idea being made into a reality. And so for me, I think Afrofuturism or speculative narratives and literature about our countries can actually be productive and can help in progressive thinking in design and in architecture. And so this is just some of the references I was looking at. I was looking obviously at seasonal migration to the north, but different theorists that have written about magic realism, Afrofuturism, and I was looking at also someone, Maryam, her name's I think Maryam Al-Sayyash, who's Saudi, I think she's Saudi Arabian, and she wrote Magical Realism, and she spoke about how actually Magic Realism was providing a form of expression for the modern feminist Saudi Arabian woman, kind of progressive thinking, which I found very interesting. I found that there's already this element of magic realism being used in the East, and I'd love to see more magic realist narratives and literature, and maybe even sci-fi, Sudanese sci-fi, being created. So for me, that's how magic realism can help in creating these hybrid urban places and inshallah making more exciting narratives that are our own examples. I don't think we need someone to tell us that Afrofuturism is a narrative for us in Sudan. I think that's where we can come in with these new forms of expression, let it be magic realism, surrealism, or sci-fi, or just postmodern thinking. I think it's very important to start getting so many of the different young creatives that we already have in Sudan to kind of speculate on new Sudan and future Sudan. What will Sudan look like in 1,000 years? What will Sudan look like in 500 years? And yeah, that's kind of my philosophy on a Magic Realist Afrabia. Thank you.